Adesso inviterei veramente, I switch in English again, eventually, sorry for the delay, but it was a great, let's say, meeting today. Mr. Meyer, which is the chief economist of Deutsche Bank, that I really thank you. This is for the slides, yeah. Okay? Thank you very much. And please, the floor is yours.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today. What I would like to discuss is probably the biggest challenge that European nations face today: adjustment in economic and monetary union. Now, for adjustment in EMU, you need growth. But what sort of growth? For adjustment, you also need funding. But what sort of funding? And how much? So these are the issues, the questions that I would like to discuss in these 20 minutes that I have. Let's first review where we come from. This is the growth that we had in the past. Very diverse. Have a look. Here, this black line is a group of countries that I abbreviate here with GIIPS. You will immediately recognize Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. So these are the countries that either have programs, IMF-led programs already, or that are presently under the scrutiny of the markets. But look how these countries did in the first decade of this century. They did very well. Very strong GDP growth. I normalized this here in the first quarter of 2000. Very strong GDP growth. France did as well, quite well. And the blue line here is Germany. There was not much growth until recently. The reason for this growth divergence, the CHIPS group doing well and Germany not doing well, was the impulse that we got when EMU was started. A very big impulse in the form of lower interest rates, primarily for countries that had in the past had high interest rate, the CHIPS group. And these countries experienced an expansion that was based on domestic demand, public consumption, private consumption, and housing investment. And that allowed them to have a very good economic performance. Germany did not benefit from this impulse. In fact, Germany was having competitiveness problems at the time, to which I will come back in a moment. Look at what, Look at what happened to the cost performance. Here we are. As the CHIPS group had domestic demand-driven growth, there was a neglect in cost control. These are unit labor costs. These are wages adjusted for productivity, and again normalized here in 2000, first quarter in 2000. As in the CHIPS group, wages grow above productivity, we had a big run-up in unit labor costs. This was possible because growth came from the domestic side. Growth came from public and private consumption and housing investment. You did not need to control your costs so much because there was no need here to grow through exports. Germany at the same time was actually having a difficult time in terms of unit labor cost control, as was having a difficult time in wage growth, as the restructuring of the German economy was taking its toll. At the same time, productivity growth grew and unit labor costs were held back. This divergence in the growth models and this cost divergence had significant impacts on the current account positions of the countries. As you can see here, the CHIPS group started out with a current account deficit at the beginning of EMU, which was not so much different of that of Germany. As domestic demand growth was driving the economies forward and as cost control was lost, the deficit moved towards 8% of GDP. France was in a similar situation, not sufficient cost control, not sufficient competitiveness, and as you can see, they moved from a surplus of their current account in 1999 to also a deficit of about 2% of GDP by now. Germany, on the other hand, given that there was sluggish domestic demand performance, as there was economic policy reform, and as there were restructuring at the company level, Germany experienced a large increase in its current account surplus. All these developments were not a problem as long as funding these imbalances was possible. Remember also that the euro area had overall a rather balanced current account. So what you see here are largely imbalances within the euro area. As long as credit was readily available, German surpluses could be rechanneled, recycled easily to fund CHIPS deficits. But when the credit market seized up, we had a problem. The funding stopped. We had what you could see in the past only in emerging market economies, namely a so-called sudden stop of capital flows. Now, what happens when you have a sudden stop? In emerging market economies, we have seen that then countries default or currency links break. In the euro area, of course, we wanted to avoid that. So we replaced the cheap private sector credit by public credit in order to keep the euro area together. What we saw in the first 8 years of the euro area was basically a performance based on cheap private sector credit that was the glue that kept the euro together. And when this glue came off and we had the risk of the euro falling apart, we replaced cheap private sector credit with official credit. Now you will immediately think of the programs that we are presently running for Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. And you would probably think that I'm talking about this. I'm also talking about this, but I'm more importantly talking about a second source of credit that comes through the euro system. We have presently a situation where we have limited credit available through the governments. We have just heard a decision yesterday from the Eurogroup to augment the so-called firewall to a total of 800 billion euros. At the same time, however, we have a credit channel through the euro system through which we have already extended almost 870 billion euros. That has already happened. So we have two ways to extend credit that are not really connected very well with each other. Let me explain what I mean, and I focus now through the credit channel, on the credit channel through the euro system. What do you do when you're a bank in a country that is cut off from external funding and you have to make payments? And you cannot fund them anymore in the market because the market doesn't trust you. Well, if you don't have any help, you have to shrink your balance sheet. That causes an economic collapse. That's not what you like to see. So therefore, this bank that has a funding problem can go to the ECB, and it obtains funds from the ECB. This is the, no, this is not. This is. This yellow line shows the share of ECB lending that is going to the CHIPS country group that has presently more or less serious troubles. What you can see from this chart, where the percentages are plotted on the right-hand side, you can see that we started out with about 15%, here almost 20% of ECB lending going to this country group. This country group has a share of about a quarter in euro area GDP, so you can say they were reasonably restrained at the beginning. As the euro crisis took momentum, as mistrust in banks in these countries grew, they had no other alternative than to go to the ECB, and now you can see that lately we have given more than 80% of all ECB loans to this country group. So the ECB has stepped in and has prevented a breakdown of the system. So what happens? The ECB gives the funds, and then I have to make payments abroad if I have a current account deficit that I cannot fund with a capital account surplus, or if I even have a capital account deficit as well. So I make my payments abroad using these ECB funds. And I do this through the euro area interbank payment system, the famous target to interbank payment system. In this bank payment system, the national central banks aggregate the payments in the nations, and then they make payments across the borders using the ECB as a clearinghouse. So we can assess the balance of payments imbalances by looking at the national bank's positions, the national central bank's positions versus the ECB. So what has happened is, as the CHIPS countries have drawn money out of the ECB to make payments into Germany, the Bundesbank has run up a very large claim on the ECB. What you can see here is the Bundesbank's position in the interbank payment system versus the ECB. When the system works well, the balance should be zero. This is what a clearinghouse really should have, a zero balance. Ingoing payments meet outgoing payments. But as the private sector was retreating in funding deficits of the CHIPS countries and others, you can see that the Bundesbank and others, which I come to, stepped in and provided the credit. So the Bundesbank has presently provided 547 billion in credit already to the countries with balance of payments deficits. What is that doing? This is the latest balance sheet of the Bundesbank. This is the target 2 claim coming out of this interbank payment system. What you can see here is that this is already the biggest asset in the Bundesbank's balance sheet, the biggest asset item in the central bank's balance sheet. You can see that this increased by almost 140 billion euros in the course of last year. It drove the balance sheet expansion. What you see here is a balance sheet that looks a bit like that of the People's Bank of China. Remember, the People's Bank of China has a lot of foreign exchange reserves that are accumulated because there are no capital flows recycling the money that the Chinese companies earn, the US and elsewhere, back to the countries where they have their export surplus with. So there's no recycling because they have capital control. So therefore the FX reserves accumulate in the People's Bank of China's balance sheet. Here, there are no reflows of capital because the Northern European banks don't trust the Southern European banks, now even France. And therefore, these positions build up in the balance sheets of the largely northern central banks. What that means is that the liquidity that is drawing out in the deficit countries is flooding now the banking systems of the northern countries. This red line gives you the position of the German banking system versus the central bank. Now, you have probably all heard in Economics 101 that generally the central bank lends money to the commercial banks. But owing to these liquidity flows that are going through the CHIPS countries and others into the northern countries, until recently, the German banking sector was lending to the Bundesbank. So the money was flowing into the German banks and they were pushing it back to the Bundesbank. But watch this here. Over the last few months, the liquidity is now flowing out into the real economy. Let's now have a look at how these imbalances have evolved. These are the different countries that, with their positions versus the ECB coming out of this interbank payment system. These are the cumulated balance of payments imbalances that have happened since we have seen the private sector flow stop. What you see here is that the countries that still have a AAA rating by the rating agencies are the ones that are giving credit to the others. When we started doing this map, which was about the middle of last year, the map was rather colorful. We had orange, light red, darker red. We had light green, middle green, darker green. Now it's getting ever more red-green. You can see that Germany, as I said, has given 547 billion. Holland, 169 billion. Luxembourg, because they have a lot of German and Dutch banks, have given 104 billion, and Finland, 45.5. When you add it all up, you'll see it almost 870 billion. It dwarfs everything that is happening at the government level. And this is money already given. The 800 that they decided yesterday is something that, of course, is the total volume of the government lending. This is the evolution of this credit mechanism over time. I'm showing this to you because of this kink. Look what has happened since the middle of 2011. All of a sudden, this gap gets larger. This is when we saw capital account deficits emerging in some countries. So it's not only current accounts that are presently funded by the system, it's also capital account deficits as capital flight has set in. And in the case of Italy, it was quite dramatic to watch our map, because until the middle of last year, the map for Italy was light green. And in the second half of last year, remember the discussions about the commitment to economic reform and so on and so forth, the map turned very red to about minus 200 billion. That was capital flight that was taking place. So, what can we do here? We can, of course, let the system run. It's unlimited, it's unconditional credit that is given. But what will happen is, this is the solution here on the left upper corner, that the liquidity that is poured into the south will find its way into the north, where it first is retained in the central banking system, remember my red line, and then it seeps out and goes into the real economy and eventually drives up the price. So we can have adjustment by inflating the north, which probably will over time lead to resistance in the north against this sort of adjustment. There's another possibility, which is on the right-hand side upper corner here, which is that we all put what has given so far through the euro system in credit, we all put this under the euro area safety umbrella, EMU. So to the 800 billion, we have to add another 870 billion, which has already been given. Now, when you have followed the discussions about the 800 billion, you can see that this is politically impossible. It will not work. So this leaves basically two possibilities. We can either eliminate country by country that cannot adjust in EMU until we have some sort of core EMU, or we have to make the countries fit for EMU. What does that mean, making the countries fit for EMU? We need to get the CHIPS countries, but also France. We need to rebuild their growth model. We need to get them out of mainly having a lot of resources in what the economists call the non-tradable goods sector. So this would be construction, domestic services. They are too large in size. We have to get these resources out, put them into the tradable goods sector. So making more for exports, producing more for import substitution. The surplus countries, Germany and others, have to do the opposite. They have too many people in the tradable goods sectors and too few in the non-tradable goods sector. So we have to engineer this change, something that will take a long time. And as we're engineering this change, we have to also accompany this change in the growth drivers through relative price adjustment. My chart before showed unit labor costs in the south, in Latin Europe, even France, too high, in Germany very low. So we have to readjust that, which means that for quite a while we'll have to have probably mild deflationary conditions in the deficit countries and mildly inflationary conditions in the surplus countries. If you start out with a gap of about 20–25%, we can't do it in a year. We have to stretch the adjustment. So take 5 percentage point inflation difference per year, and you can do it over 5 years. But it's the question, what is the floor of inflation? If the South could manage 0, we would have in Germany 5. If the South can only manage +3, then in Germany we would have +8. So these are the questions that we will be struggling with for the years to come. How much inflation in the surplus countries? If it's too much, these countries may see political forces develop to say we want to get out of the euro. How much deflation in the deficit countries? If it's too much, political forces will take us out of the euro. And therefore, who will remain and who will leave the euro? These are the key questions over the next couple of years. Now, my best guess is that the centrifugal economic forces created by this dilemma will not overwhelm the concentric political forces. This is going to be the optimization task, if you want. Make sure that the political concentric forces, the political will to stick together, remains larger than the economic centrifugal forces created by this dilemma. So therefore, I think we will have a long period ahead of struggle. We will get, and we already got, some ECB help with that. Ideally, I would like to combine these two layers of funding, the one through the governments with conditionality and the one through the euro system, which is unconditional and unlimited. I would like to combine this, and this is why already 2 years ago I suggested the creation of a European Monetary Fund as a counterpart through the ECB who would manage this adjustment process. So I've already overrun my time. Apologies for that. And thank you very much for your attention.
Grazie. Ecco, questo, siamo partiti con gli scenari ieri mattina e abbiamo concluso per certi versi con questo, per dire che tutto quello che noi diciamo, tutto lo sforzo che noi stiamo cercando di produrre, l'urgenza della crescita, comunque all'interno di un contesto che rimane fortemente incerto. Non c'è bisogno che io lo dica evidentemente a imprenditori, a manager che lavorano quotidianamente all'interno di questi condizionamenti. Gli scenari sono aperti, gli stessi nostri economisti diciamo, fanno fatica a definire quello che accadrà. E quindi l'opportunità comunque di spingere verso la crescita è l'unico modo. Quando si vedono dei tassi di differenza nel costo del lavoro come quelli che sono stati evidenziati, è chiaro che c'è in mezzo un tema di produttività del lavoro e quindi è evidente che su quel fronte bisogna lavorare attraverso l'innovazione, la riorganizzazione e eventualmente la ricerca di nuovi mercati.